Let me just start off by saying I hope everyone who watches my channel has a very Merry Christmas. I hope you all get the presents you're wanting, and if you aren't spending Christmas with anyone, I hope you just have a good day, and I hope you enjoy your day very much. Today we're going to be reading Strange Christmas Game, which is a creepypasta based around Christmas. I think it's quite relevant. So have a Merry Christmas, guys. Let's get into the story. It was the middle of November when we arrived at Martindale, and we found the place anything but romantic or pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, the trees were leafless, there were no flowers, save a few late pink roses blooming in the garden. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. Claire would not ask Alice down to keep her company in the winter months, as she had intended. And for myself, the Cronsons were still absent in New Norfolk, where they meant to spend Christmas with old Miss Cronson, now recovered. Altogether, Martindale seemed dreary enough, and the ghost stories we had laughed at while sunshine flooded the room became less unreal, when we had nothing but blazing fires and wax candles to dispel the gloom. They became more real when the servant after servant left us to seek situations elsewhere, when noises grew frequent in the house, when we ourselves, Claire and I, with our own ears heard the tramp, the banging and the chattering which had been described to us. My dear reader, you doubtless are free from superstitious fancies. You pooh-pooh the existence of ghosts, and, quote, only wish you could find a haunted house in which to spend the night, end quote. Which is all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait till you're left in a dreary, desolate old mansion, filled with the most uncountable sounds, without a servant, with no old caretaker and his wife, who, living at the extremest end of the building, heard nothing of the tramp, bang, bang going on at all hours of the night. At first, I imagined the noises were produced by some evil-disposed persons who wished, for purposes of their own, to keep the house uninhabited, but by degrees, Claire and I came to the conclusion that the visitation must be supernatural, and Martindale, by consequence, unattendable. Still, being practical people, unlike our predecessors, not having money to live where and how we liked, we decided to watch and see however we could trace any human influence in the matter. If not, it was agreed that we were to pull down the right wing of the house and the principal staircase. For nights and nights we sat up till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, Claire engaged in needlework, I reading with a revolver lying on the table beside me, but nothing. Neither sound nor appearance rewarded our vigil. This confirmed my first ideas that the sounds were not supernatural, but just to test the matter, I determined on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, to keep watch myself in the red bed chamber. Even to Claire I never mentioned my intentions. About 10. Tired of our previous vigils, we each retired to rest. Somewhat ostentatiously, perhaps, I noisily shut the door of my room, and when I opened it half an hour afterwards, Home Mouse could have pursued his way along the corridor with greater silence and caution than myself. Quiet in the dark, I sat in the red room for over an hour. I might as well have been in my grave. I couldn't see anything in the apartment. But at the end of that time, the moon had rose and cast strange lights across the floor and upon the wall of my haunted chamber. Hitherto I kept my watch opposite the window. Now I changed my place to a corner near the door, where I was shaded from observation by the heavy hangings off the bed and an antique wardrobe. Still I sat on, but still no sound broke the silence. I was weary with many nights watching, and tired of my solitary vigil. I dropped at last into a slumber from which I awakened by hearing the door softly open. "John?" said my sister, almost in a whisper. "John, are you here?" "Yes, Claire," I answered. "What are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she replied. "They're in the oak parlour." I did not need any explanation as to whom she meant, but crept downstairs after her, warned by an unlifted hand of the necessity for silence and caution. By the open of the oak parlour, she paused, and we both looked in. There was the room we left in darkness overnight, with a bright wood fire blazing on the hearth, candles on the chimney-piece, the small table pulled out from its accustomed corner, and 2 men seated beside it, playing at cribbage. We could see the face of the younger player. It was that of a man about 25, of a man who had lived hard and wickedly, who had wasted his substance and his health, who had been, while in the flesh, Jeremy Lester. It would be difficult for me to say how I knew this, how in a moment I identified the features of the player with those of the man who had been missing for 41 years. 41 years that very night. He was dressed in a costume of a bygone period. His hair was powdered, and round his wrists there were ruffles of lace. He looked at the one who, having come from some great party, had sat down, after his return home to play cards, with an intimate friend. On his little finger there sparkled a ring. In front of his shirt there gleamed a valuable diamond. There were diamond buckles in his shoes, and according to the fashion of his time, he wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shape of his remarkably good leg and ankle. He sat opposite the door, but never once lifted his eyes to it. His attention seemed concentrated on the cards. For a time there was utter silence in the room, broken by only the momentous counting of the game. In the doorway we stood, holding our breath, terrified but fascinated by the scene which was being acted before us. The ashes dropped on the hearth slowly, and like snow we could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table. We listened to the count. 15-2, 15-4, and so forth, but there was no other word spoken, till at the length the player, whose face we could not see, exclaimed, "I win! The game is mine!" Then his opponent took up the cards, sorted them over negligently in his hand, put them close together, and flung the whole pack in his guest's face, exclaiming, "Cheat! Liar! Take that!" There was a bustle and confusion, a flinging over the chairs, and such a noise of passionate voices mingling that we could not hear the sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room, in so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood. Out of the room, and tramp up the stairs to the Red Room, whence he descended into a few minutes with a couple of rapiers under his arm. When he re-entered the room, he gave, as it seemed to us, the other man his choice of weapons, and then flung open the window. And after he ceremoniously giving place to his opponent, to pass out first, he walked forth into the night air, Claire and I following him. We went through the garden and down the narrow winding walk to a small piece of turf, sheltered from the north by the plantation of the young fair trees. It was a bright moonlight night by this time, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester measuring off the ground. "When you say free," he said to the man whose back was still towards us, "they had drawn lots of ground, and the lot had fallen against Mr. Lester." He stood thus with the moonbeams falling upon him, and the handsome fellow I would never desire to behold. "1," began the other. "2," and before the kinsman had the slightest suspicion of his design, he was upon him, and his rapier through Jeremy Lester's breast. At the sight of that cowardly treachery, Claire screamed aloud. In a moment the combatants had disappeared. The moon was obscured behind a cloud, and we were standing in the shadow of the fair plantation, shivering with cold and terror. But we knew at last what had become of the late owner of Martindale, that he had fallen, not in a fair fight, but foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a white world, to behold the ground and trees and shrubs all laden and covered with snow. There was snow everywhere, such snow as no person could remember have fallen for 41 years. "It was on such a Christmas as this that Mr. Jeremy disappeared," remarked the old sexton to my sister, who had insisted on dragging me through the snow to church. Whereupon Claire fainted away and was carried to the vestry, where I made a full confession to the vicar of all we had beheld the previous night. At first, that worthy individual rather inclined to treat the matter lightly, but when, a fortnight after, the snow melted away and the fair plantation came to be examined, he confessed there might be more things in heaven and earth than his limited philosophy had dreamed of. In a little dear space just within the plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. We knew by the ring and the diamond buckles, and the sparkling breastpin, and Mr. Cronson, who in his capacity as magistrate came over to inspect these relics, was visibly perturbed by my narrative. "Pray, Mr. Lester, did you not in your dreams see the face of the gentleman, your kinsman's opponent?" "No," I answered. He sat down and stood his back up to us all the time. "There was nothing more, of course, to be done in the matter," observed Mr. Cronson. "Nothing," I replied, and then the affair would doubtlessly have been terminated. But there were a few days afterwards, when we were dining at Cronson Park, Claire all of a sudden dropped the glass of water she was carrying to her lips and examined. "Look, John! There he is!" Rose from her seat, and with her face as white as the tablecloth pointed to a portrait hanging on the wall. "I saw him for an instant when he had turned his head towards the door as Jeremy Lester left it," she explained. "That's him!" Of what followed after the identification, I have only the vaguest recollection. Servants rushed hither and thither. Miss Cronson dropped off her chair into hysterics. The young ladies gathered round the mamma. Mr. Cronson, trembling like in an ague fit, attempted some kind of explanation while Claire kept praying to be taken away, only to be taken away. I took her away, not merely from Cronson Park, but from Martindale. Before we left the latter place, however, I had an interview with Mr. Cronson, who said the portrait Claire had identified was that of his wife's father, the last person who had saw Jeremy Lester alive. "He's an old man now," finished Mr. Cronson, "a man of over 80, who has confessed everything to me. You won't bring any further sorrow or disgrace upon by making this matter public." I promised him I would keep my silence, but the story gradually oozed out, and the Cronsons left the country. My sister never returned to Martindale either. She married and is now living in London, though I assure her there are no strange noises in my house. She will not visit Bedfordshire, where the, quote, little girl wanted me so long ago to think of her seriously, is now my wife, and the mother of my children. Right, that's the end of the story, guys. I hope you all have a great Merry Christmas. Thanks for listening if you did. I hope you have a brilliant time. I hope you get everything you wanted on Christmas. I've been GilloBoiJr. So long now.